Hello, welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 159th episode. Today, we will talk with Mark Domitrak, Global Head of Research at CT Group. Mark has built a career around strategic communication and media campaigns, and he has lots of insights on consumer and corporate sentiment at the current juncture. Mark, welcome to Kopi Time.
No, thank you very much for having me, and thank you again to everyone who's tuning in.
Great to have you, Mark. And let's warm up by some proper intro. What is Citigroup Group, and what do you do as its head of research?
Sure. So at CT Group, we're a sort of global campaigns and communications firm. And what we do is, look, we help our clients get the outcome they want, get the outcome they desire based on evidence. Now, that evidence can be research, be it community research, community diagnostic research. It can be intelligence, it can be data. But what we're really interested in is what's driving attitudes to the issue that the client has. What's that underlying behaviour towards the client's issue, and how can they then, being aware of that, what do they need to do to get their desired outcome? And we've got offices in Singapore, Sydney, London, Abu Dhabi, Paris, and even Washington, DC. So I'm quite lucky as head to be global research. There's two things. I look at the integrity, the robustness of our research to make sure that that methodology is tight. And the accuracy of it, and we can talk about accuracy in research. But the other role, which I think is really part of my favourite, is looking at that global research, identifying what are those trends, regardless of the country, regardless of the religion, regardless of the language, what's motivating people? What's driving their behaviour? And there's never a day we're not doing research in any part of the world. So looking at those global trends, identifying them, and then helping our clients to say, look, here's what you need to be aware of, helping them make better decisions as a result of that.
Mark, in your experience, are companies interested in cross-country evidence, or they're very focused on a country or a segment at any given time, and they just want to look at the nearby peers, or they are enlightened enough to take advantage of your global footprint and want to hear your perspective from a cross-country basis?
We're seeing, I think, given the how would you put it, the polite way, global uncertainty that's currently going on, people are now more interested in what's being done by other countries, especially other like-minded countries, and what's motivating consumers in there. What that does is provide some sort of a benchmark of what they should be aspiring to, especially companies who have multi-marketed outlays. And as a result of that, they're then able to make decisions that are better informed because you know not only where you're at, but where you might be or where you could have been had you not made separate decisions. So that comparison of attitudes, that comparison of where people are sort of focusing their efforts is becoming more and more important. So therefore needing to understand what's happening in other markets, be they like yours or not, becomes more important in decision making.
Sure, and I want to touch on that issue. Earlier, you talked about research methodology, and I'm really curious that, when you try to get the pulse of societies, communities, consumers, how you're adapting to what I think is sort of increasing uncertainty in hearing from people what they really believe in. So, Mark, over the last decade, we have seen a bunch of developments which some people saw coming, but consensus did not see coming, whether it was Brexit or Trump 1.0 or Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the extent of or the duration of the trade war that we have. So I guess the question that I want to ask you is that in your research, did you pick up early warning of these events? And if yes, how?
I think when we go back, I was looking at the research we've done going back to sort of 2013, 2014, 2015, and that's where you sort of saw a lot of these trends come through. There was a very identifiable, what we identified as what we call a quiet anger in the community. In the UK, that quiet anger manifested itself in terms of really strong pressure on services, be it the NHS, schools, transport. And they saw that as we have these internal pressures. We have immigration, which is sort of, there's no real plan for what are we going to do with immigration. And that the Brexit debate tapped into that. So you could foresee where that was going. In the US, that quiet anger was done by people who, which you sort of now seeing these exact issues play out, where they thought they were losing their jobs, to sort of foreign investment or foreign companies or foreign trade. They didn't see the economy getting better or their personal financial situation they didn't think was going to get better. And I think that what really sort of tapped into that quiet anger was a sense that we're not being heard. And so you then saw that the Trump campaign sort of gave voice to that quiet anger. Understanding what was driving that behaviour sort of made it easy to see where these big trends, therefore, were coming from. Let's just say with Ukraine, Putin's anger wasn't so quiet, and having taken over Crimea, sort of saw an opportunity and took it. So our view is with those sort of issues, it's not turning a blind eye to it, but it's being aware of why people are making the decisions they are and why people are focused where they are. And if you understand that, then you'll go for the cause, i.e. pressure on public services, pressure on the NHS, pressure on housing. It gives you a better sense then of where the public are going to go.
But Mark, it seems to me, I mean, at least this is what I see when we talk to pollsters in the US, that there is also the quiet, angry people, their disinclination to respond to pollsters and their proclivity sometimes to actually not tell them the truth. So life becomes very hard that you go and do a random sampling of 1,000 people, you ask them questions, you hear 52% will go one way, the election result comes out, it actually 52% went a different way. So two questions. One is, are we seeing this polarization entrenched, which is the societies are kind of 50-50, things happen on the margin and can't really use that marginal outcome as a major trend because the next time 50-50 could go the other direction. So that's one thing that I want to hear from you. And the second is this potency or predictive power of polls. Is it worsening?
Let me take the second part first,
Sure.
I should say. There tends to be, especially by the commentariat and the media, sort of what I would still class as a misunderstanding of what the purpose of polls are. A poll is not a predictor. It's not a crystal ball. It's not going to tell you what's going to happen in the future. If it was that good, you use it at the race course or you take it to the casino. What a poll is a measure in time. Here's what people think at a particular point in time. Now, it is easy for media and for commentators to say, here's where people are at, here's what they're doing. But to expect that to happen again in 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks' time, again, misunderstands what it is. The way we use polls is to say, look, here's what people think, great, but why do they think that? What's driving that? What's that element? And that's what you see missing in a lot of the published polls. And that's why I think you get the results that you have where people say, well, the polls were wrong. Well, no, the polls weren't wrong. The job of the polls was not to predict the future for you. If you understood, let's go back, why were people having those views? Why were people focused on those particular issues? That gives you a greater understanding. That then, bizarrely, lets you predict, if you like, better what the outcome will be. I think in the last two elections, you're right, there was very much a sense of, especially in states like Pennsylvania, where everybody was being polled every 2 seconds. There's very, very much a sense of fatigue. But that just shows you need other ways to get around that. For example, more in-person type polling. What you would do then is bring in various sort of data platforms as well to bring in various other data points to help you draw conclusions. But again, if you're trying to use the poll to predict the future, no matter of sampling is going to help you do that. If you're using the poll to help you identify why people are thinking and how they change their mind, that's a separate focus.
Mark, am I correct in saying that CT Group did do some polling in the US last year?
So we did some for ourselves. We didn't do anything for any campaign. It wasn't for anyone. It was very much sort of for our internal purposes, for fun. That's what we do.
But was it interesting? I mean, in terms of this, what we were just discussing, that did you feel in your work with the U.S. that it was a 50-50 nation, or did you feel that things were shifting in a decisive manner toward Trump?
What we found was what we called the quiet Trump voter. So this is a person who did not vote last time, but was very keen to vote this time. We did research in Georgia and Pennsylvania, because obviously the two dominant swing states. And what we found was when we put together all the hours of the research that we did and all the data, we came up with, if you like, a psychograph. And that is a personification of who that swinging voter was. We gave him a name. His name was Mike. He lived sort of in the outer suburbs of the area. He drove a diesel car. He wasn't college educated, had a manual job. But what really drove him was the economy. He thought he was worse off than he had been 4 years ago, and he was going to get worse off. He thought his family was financially worse off and was going to get worse off. He didn't vote for Trump last time. And I think a lot of polls missed him because they said because he didn't vote last time, they take him out of the sample. He was going to vote this time. But what he wanted to hear from Trump was more about the economy, more about being on my side. And the more he heard that, the more likely he was to come out. Similarly, there was a lady called Grace, who was sort of the Harris campaign needed to get her out. She was also worried about jobs, more worried about childcare, and she wanted to hear that from Harris to get out. But all she was hearing was democracy, threats to democracy. So she was less inclined. On the day, Grace stayed home, Mike came out.
All right. That is really, really cool. And I hope that you guys do more stuff like this going forward, because the next elections are going to be pretty interesting and consequential as well, and not just in the US.
No, exactly. I think that comes. So you asked also about bubbles, if you like, and we are seeing that very, very much in all our research. Is the views of the people in the inner city who are college educated and sort of probably earn a bit more average, higher income, have very different views to the rest of the community. Now, a lot of your journalists and your decision makers and politicians are drawn from one particular group over the other. And that's why I think you're going to continue to see this sort of tension on issues, be it climate change, be it AI, because you have two separate groups still coming from two different perspectives. And you saw that writ large, if you like, in the US election, where people would say, oh, everybody I know is voting Democrat. Everybody I know thinks this. Well, yes, but everybody you know is in your bubble. We're seeing that here in the region too. For example, people talk about the KL bubble or the Jakarta bubble. Here in Singapore, what we find is that you're less likely now to hang out with someone in a different income bracket than you were 5 years ago. So these sort of splits do have implications. And I think when people are making decisions, be they politicians, be they boards, you need to be aware of who's your mic? Are you outside your bubble or are you comfortable in it? And I think that over the next year, 2 years, is going to be absolutely critical to ensuring you get better decision making.
So, Mark, that level of discomfort, or for lack of a better word, anxiety, is palpable. It's worldwide, and whether you see it stemming from disruptive tech, or the wars we have in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, or China-U.S. tension, protectionism, all sorts of things, making people anxious. So again, from a research methodology perspective, or just a day-to-day applied research perspective, how do you grade these levels of anxiety?
What we do in our research is look at what it is that people believe are those important issues government should do something about. And we don't do it as a list. If you do it as a list, people then tend to see an issue, go, oh, that's important. Oh, that's important. If you do it at open end, straight away, top of mind, what are those issues that are important? And what we're finding is that regardless of the country, you could be in Mongolia or Melbourne or Manchester or Mumbai, cost of living still tends to dominate. So this is how people perceive issues. They tend to, cost of living, absolutely dominant. In some markets, for example, in the US, it was very much driven by inflation. In other countries, it tends to be driven more by economic growth, government borrowing as well. But everybody's still concerned about the cost of living. And that's how they approach every issue is, yes, the war's critical, but what's the impact here in terms of my cost of living? Yes, the global uncertainty, tariffs, what have you. But again, how's that relevant to my cost of living? That then becomes the lens through which a lot of issues are seen. And that is where the people go, the politicians go, and where the politicians go, the policies go. So I think you will start to see far more, especially here in the region, people looking very, very much at cost of living and how to continue to assist on that, and that will be the dominant issue. There's talk, for example, in Indonesia, where you've got what some would say a two-tiered economy, manufacturing going very well, but consumer spending very, very low, of more incentives to come in through there. So I think cost of living, despite everything that's going on, will continue to drive. It was the driver in the US election, in the UK, to extent in Australia and Japan as well.
So you'd say that anxiety about jobs would be secondary to just the day-to-day cost of procuring essentials for your loved ones.
It would fit into that. It would fit into that. So when you're thinking about your cost of living, you're thinking about how am I going to provide? So that's already the stress. But not how am I going to provide today, next week, 2 weeks, this time next year. The kids are going to a higher grade of school. How am I going to pay those school fees? It comes up in that personally relevant issue. And so talking about issues, how do you then connect to make them personally relevant for people?
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the big story of the moment, which is the trade war and all this tariff-related mayhem. The companies that you're speaking with, how are the boardrooms in these companies, dealing with tariff mayhem?
Look, I think it's for those who've accepted the reality that the horse has changed, the planning and the scenario planning goes deeper, and they're acknowledging for the long term. We do work with some clients who think, oh, look, we're just going to hold on for the next 2 years, then the Democrats will come in or there'll be a Democrat president and everything's going to be fine. The danger with that is two things. Go back to the audiences. Who's the audience who makes the decision? And the audience here, go back to Mike. Again, one of the reasons he voted for Trump was because he thought that the US was being done over. Now, by that he meant, look, we're involved in wars we shouldn't be. We fund all other countries when we should be looking after ourselves. That drove him. So when it comes to the tariffs, he agrees with the proposition of the tariffs, which Trump says is to bring manufacturing back to the US, make more things back in the US. And he agrees with that. He also agrees government should be interventionist, a bit more interventionist in the economy as well. So the key decision makers, if you like, in the US coming up to the elections are supportive of this approach. So it's not going to change. And you look at the Democrat side, what the Democrats have attacked is not necessarily the policy, but rather how it was done. And be it Bernie Sanders, who says, of course I'd use tariffs as president. Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who could potentially be a presidential candidate, says, I understand the motivation behind the tariffs. Here's where President Trump and I do agree. We need to make more stuff in America, more cars and more chips, more steel and more ships. So you have a body there. So those companies who have gone, yep, this is here for the long haul, are making more strategic decision, better long-term planning than those that think, this is just a bubble and we can ride it out.
Mark, but when we look at investment decisions, there are these announcements which are seismic in nature. Many companies are saying hundreds of billions of dollars would be invested in the US. But when we look at the actual evidence, it seems to me that there seems to be a disconnect because there seems to be this notion within the boardroom, at least the way I look at it, and I'd like to hear your view, maybe you don't agree with me, is that they're kind of paralyzed by the uncertainty. Because on the 2nd of April, we had one set of tariffs. Over the subsequent 3 months, some tariffs went up, some tariffs went down. We still have various sectoral reviews going on pharma and on tech, semiconductors, and so on. So those tariffs could be higher. Now, in the last 48 hours, you and I have both read there are export taxes in the US. If you're selling stuff to China, you got to pay 15% surcharge to the US Treasury. So have things settled down, even if you don't believe that this is going to, if you believe that this is going to be lasting, not just a bubble. Are you still on solid ground to start making strategic decisions for the next 3 to 5 years?
I think what we've been working with boards on is you now need more scenarios than before. So before it could have been 1 or 2 options. Exactly as you said, it's now 4 or 5 options. But the point is, don't think it's not going to happen, or don't try and think, look, this isn't realistic. What may have seemed before as unrealistic, 100% tariffs on China, for example, 25% increased tariffs on India, is now conceivable. So your planning is no longer theoretic. You need the more tools you have, the more scenarios that you have planned, the more you'll be better able to anticipate and be ready for when the inevitable does come. It's those who think, look, that's not going to happen or he'll change his mind, who are often left caught out. What we see too is there's a lot of, because of the two-tiered economy where economic growth very strong in this region, but not so much in established economies, you've got more capital coming here, more businesses. And so there's more competition and more pressure. We've been talking to one CEO and she said to me, Mark, before it was just enough for me to know who my competitor was. Now I need to know where my competitor do their manufacturing, what their supply chains are, where do they store, where do they ship from, because then I can overlay the tariffs and see where I can start to play. And I know I need to do that because they're doing the exact same thing to me. So that scenario planning has broadened, and that knowledge needs to go deeper of not just your competitors, but also yourself and where you could get picked off.
Right. So that is the complexity that seems inevitable that would be associated with the cost of doing business with the US. Are we seeing some degree of coordination among the non-US actors? So whether they want to trade with the US or trade amongst each other, is there a sense of, we're all in it together and let's coordinate? Or has Trump managed to divide the whole world and everybody's for themselves?
I think what you've seen the US do is force countries to reevaluate their relationships and what it is that they probably stand for. I think I'm right in saying Prime Minister Wong here in Singapore said what you'll see is like-minded nations start to come together more on issues. Look what's happening in Europe, for example, where Europe has said to some extent, look, we need to look after ourselves more. We need to be stronger ourselves. We can't rely on the US as much as we could. So they're increasing their defence spending. There's been reports this week out of Taiwan, for example, where Taiwan haven't got the trade deal they want. And there are some stories coming out there of, well, what is our relationship with the US? Where is that going? I think if you're a US company now, there will potentially be pressure over the coming year to say, look, almost to remind people of that certainty that you can provide. So in the UK, for example, in our research, we saw a shift amongst the general population where people weren't as supportive of having the US invest in defence funding as they were 2 years ago. In Australia, so these are two very strong allies of the US. In Australia, people, I think around 15% of Australians say our relationship with the US, the best days are ahead of us. Around 55% say the best days are behind us. We went a bit further in Australia. 36% of people said that they would support downgrading the relationship with the US. 33% are against it. So 3% different, but that's still quite a significant part. So people in these countries are now starting to say, look, what is that relationship with the US? How reliable can they be? Now, that provides opportunities, for example, for some firms who may have American competition to sort of position in the marketplace, but likewise for American firms is how do you now position yourself in the marketplace when you're starting to see this undercurrent of uncertainty created about the US and activities with the US?
Mark, I was in Copenhagen a couple of months ago in the grocery stores there, like made in America maple syrup or bourbon whiskey. They put a little star next to it so that people can boycott those products. So yeah,
exactly.
I mean,
you can see that real world example of, and so if you're those US firms, well, how do we reconnect? How do we make ourselves relevant again? But I think that is not just in the boardroom, but sort of around the kitchen table. These decisions are being made now too.
It's pretty palpable. I can see that on Australia, Mark, I'll just share with you that in the last, say, 10 years, I've seen successive Australian government officials come to Singapore, and their vision of where Australia's future lies, in my own eyes, in the last 10 years, have transformed completely. During Trump 1.0 and part of Biden administration, they were very Western-centric, and they were talking about how they see the Quad, Australia, India, China, Japan, Korea, being these four like-minded economies in concert with the US. In the last couple of years, I've seen a sea change where the Australian government officials are again recognizing their centrality within Asia and their symbiosis with China and others. So yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, the countries and companies are re-evaluating where they stay with this competition in mind.
Yeah, you mentioned Australia. We've just, this year's a great example. You had a Prime Minister visit and then the state visit by the Governor General, I think last week or the week before, reinforcing again the importance, not just of Singapore in the hub, but of those realignments.
By all means. I want to just go back to you because you're just touching on UK and European sort of a situation a little bit. When you look at your client universe in that part of the world, as you pointed out that defense spending is going up. There is this notion that can't rely on the U.S. on defense matters as much. But in terms of dealing with China or dealing with the global South, either UK or Europe, where do you see? I mean, are they being strategic enough, or you feel like you have to guide them toward thinking about those? It's not a bubble, but there's a seismic change coming to the world.
Yeah, there's certainly enormous economic opportunities here as well. And defence. Our office is not near La Poussette, and that's where President Macron was a few weeks ago.
That's right.
So I think that there is that reevaluation very much here. There is an awareness of that too. There are people, obviously, there are some companies who are given the slow growth relative to this part of the world in Western Europe, people looking for bargains, but they are very, very much looking to this part of the world to grow. We've seen a 42% increase here in Singapore in private family offices, 38% increase in food and beverage businesses here as well. So that tells you consumers are spending. So the region, the days of the region, it's almost sort of a new renaissance where, given the economic growth, given the relative political stability too, and we can discuss that, but the relative political stability too, you are seeing firms look more to this region than before and look for those opportunities given the shifts.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Mark. I mean, when we look at the data, both with respect to financial flows as well as foreign direct investment, countries like Malaysia, Singapore are basically going through a golden age. It's never been this strong. It's pretty remarkable. I want to shift the subject from just a ongoing conjunctural uncertainty to bigger sort of medium-term issues. So one is the issue of climate change. With Trump 2.0, there's been some very serious pushback. And when you look at the big, beautiful bill, clearly leaning the U.S. toward fossil fuel-related developments and certainly taking some of those credits and incentives associated with green energy transition. So are companies sort of going with the U.S. zeitgeist? Climate change is passé now?
Our advice to companies on climate change, ESG, these issues, if you believe in it and really believed in it, there's no reason it shouldn't be relevant still. Now, how you message it's going to have to change to make it relevant to, as exactly we're talking about, cost of living, what have you. But these issues are still very, very relevant. What we find, be it in Malaysia or the UK or the US, people are looking for businesses to create jobs. And what are they doing in the economy to help grow the economy? And as a result of that, the G part of the ESG, now is almost the time to talk about that, because you can't have a strong E, you can't have a strong S if you don't have a strong G. And making that relevant, talking to that in terms that people want to hear. We've been working with some clients, for example, they say, look, if you think cost of living is bad now, imagine what it's going to be like in 5 years when climate change starts to impact crops.
Yep.
If you think that goods are expensive now, imagine what it's going to be like if we had to do all that manufacturing here, and in terms of the labour costs and sort of pay those prices. So it's providing a context, it's providing some messaging that makes it worthwhile. Those issues are still important, and they still should be treated as important. How you communicate that needs to be changed, but because you're exactly right, it's that context has changed, but doesn't mean the importance of the issue has.
And the fact that companies are like deleting the reference to ESG from their websites and so on, you think that's just being astute and pragmatic? It's not really changing the core beliefs of companies.
It's been, yeah. I think it's been astute and pragmatic, but there's certainly an opportunity to give those issues voice as well. And people will be looking for people to defend those issues and to say why these issues matter to me, but in, again, a way that's personally relevant.
Okay, so let's shift to the issue that is both of short-term and long-term nature, which is tech disruption, namely from AI. Now, there's a lot of theoretical discussion about this, that AI is going to improve in such a dramatic manner that we're going to have a lot of white collar jobs fully automated, and it would create a crisis of jobs first actually in the developed world, but it might also follow into the aspiring developing world, which wants to sort of move up the value ladder. What are you picking up? Is that anxiety really a rich country issue, or are we seeing this across the board? And what are companies thinking?
We're seeing this across the board, and what we're seeing, for example, if it's for developed countries, a lot of people, especially families, are worried about what's that job that my son or daughter are going to have out of school. So even if they're doing law, for example, well, why are you doing law? Because there's a concern that mid-range that will get you on the ladder and therefore you can get career could potentially be gone by AI. Very much an attack, if you like, on that upper white collar working class, and that's causing concern. That's very, very much causing concern amongst families, especially when they're looking for the future. And where is it that we want to be based? Here in the region, it's a huge issue too, because it takes away a lot of those jobs which have been core to some economies. So, for example, I was in Manila, and I know there's a lot of very deep concern there about AI. Around 2 million Filipinos work in call centres. Now, literally as of today, you don't need a call centre. AI could do that. So what's the re-education look like? What is the new skills that you're going to help these people develop as they move out and move into other areas? So boards are using it in their planning, using it in day-to-day. Where we see the clever boards use it is more to take away administrative tasks that helps them think more, that helps them focus on strategic issues and do more strategic planning. I think what we are seeing, I talked about bubbles too, what you'd call those inner city people with sort of higher incomes, college educated or postgraduate degree, more favourable to AI than the community, than the general community. Now, what's the consequence of that? The consequences of that could well be that AI might not be able to reach its full potential, or where some see the potential, because of regulation. Given the general community's concern, it won't be long that until politicians start to regulate or try and attempt to regulate AI. So there is still very much a case to be made of, what is AI? I go on Google and type in some words and that comes up. That's fine. Or is it sort of the really forward predictive? So what is AI? Why does it matter? And what are the benefits of it? Because given there's a bit of that gap about the benefits, if you're a politician and looking to an election, people aren't happy about AI, or to your point, nervous or concerned about it. Regulation. Bring in regulation, try and dampen it, and you can see and you can see why that would happen. So, anyone who's in AI, you need to make that case and make that case publicly, because again, on these things, no one's going to do it for you. A lot of people say, well, politicians should do this. Well, why? Have you made the case publicly? Have you given them that social permission to make the case? And if they do what you say, are you prepared to come out and back them? Are you prepared to say, yes, this is a good idea? That's what people are looking for more, especially given this uncertainty and the caution we were talking about earlier.
Right. That quiet anger you were talking about might become very non-quiet, disquiet.
Exactly.
Because, it will be much more sort of clear and present in people's mind if we start saying, Mark, I think that the disruption will not begin with mass firing. It'll be like a very little hiring. And that on the margin just makes harder and harder for people to find themselves gainfully employed. I think that's the way it could go if indeed, these sort of prophecies about it becoming super intelligent and being able to do everything we want come in. Mark,
it also comes in, sorry to interrupt, but also comes into what's the future of work. So what we've been working and sort of hearing with some of our clients is, the notion that you and I had growing up of you get a job, you get another job. Those sort of days are starting to break down. You could have 2 or 3 jobs. You could also have your own. You could then have your digital sort of career as well. So the notion of work and what work is like in the next 10 years, AI could well fit into that quite neatly. But again, it's making that case of where are we going? What does work look like? What does that mean? And how does it fit into that?
Mark, also going back to that anxiety issue that we discussed earlier, that so far the evidence of people in the gig economy is that they actually become more anxious because there isn't a solidity of having a corporate behind you.
Yeah.
It doesn't provide you a group insurance plan or 26 days of leave. You're sort of your own boss. I think for some people it's okay, but I think for a lot of people it's a really hard adoption.
That transitional adaptation is going to be a tough period. Agreed.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about the US and Europe and also Southeast Asia. Let's talk a little bit about China. When you talk to Southeast Asian companies, which are not of Chinese origin, but grown from ground up in Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, and so on, how are they dealing with Chinese know-how, Chinese tech, and Chinese capital?
It's one of the things that's amazed me being in the region is sort of the focus on the US, yet it's still China that is the dominant trading partner. Take Indonesia, there was a lot of excitement about the trade deal that was done, yet the US only represents 10%, whereas China's 25, 26%, I think I'm saying. There is, I think what you're seeing is sort of that ability to separate the political from the tech as well. A lot of what China is doing is sort of quite advanced, and companies and businesses are looking to get involved in that. The being associated with China is still for some not so much a hindrance, but just a sort of a caution that still needs to be navigated, especially if they're operating in other markets as well.
And in terms of the role of Chinese capital, are we going to see a spate of Southeast Asian companies that will be acquired by Chinese businesses? Will we see a lot of strategic investments where you do joint ventures as opposed to the Chinese coming and just kind of flooding your market with those things? Will countries play a little bit of more pragmatic game vis-a-vis China, where they would insist on some degree of coexistence as opposed to just opening themselves to flows and ideas from China to take over their markets?
I think you're already seeing some of that pragmatism come in already. You look at sort of the visits that you've had from the region into China. You've seen sort of China's involvement as well. That suits, again, China's economy is still. Some have argued that it sort of hasn't really recovered from the housing in 2020, 2021. So that sort of model of that greater cooperation, you're seeing that here in the region. I think you'll continue to see more of that cooperation too, especially given, as we were talking about earlier, with people looking at the US again or giving the US a second look, starting to then look for, well, where's that resourcing going to come from and how are we going to achieve this?
At the beginning of this conversation, you talked about Prime Minister Wong's speech after the big reciprocal day tariffs were announced. It was a rather strident speech about Singapore's underlying model of open markets and open trade being challenged, and how we've sort of benefited from the benevolence of large Western powers, and maybe we can take it for granted. What's your sense? Is Singapore, by being that worried and that paranoid, rightly placed to deal with all these mayhem?
There's a reason that speech went viral, and there was a reason that speech got such a huge. Friends of mine who aren't political at all were like, "Oh, did you see that speech for the Singaporean Prime Minister?" So I think he touched a chord about that friendship and about the need to be able to rely. And I think Singapore has demonstrated throughout its now 60 years that it can be that bridge to the region, but that it also has its own values. It also has its own purpose as well. So that will become all the more important in navigating as we see shifting alliances come through.
I think that's a really, really good note to end this conversation. Mark, thank you so much for your time and insights.
No worries. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
It was great to have you, and I'd like to thank our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Spy Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. This podcast is for information only, does not constitute any trade advice. All 159 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube, as well as on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications webinars, you can find them all by searching DBS Research Library. Have a great day.